system.
Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episode and we will discuss on future pandemic preparations and response. We have our world famous speaker Dr. Asim Mosa, Mr. David Schumacher and Professor David Smith. First, I would like to give chance Dr. Mosa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sharif, and all amazing speaker. It's my pleasure to be with you today and speak about the future pandemic preparation and response. Because what's happened, in COVID-19, all the world, was not prepared, well for this, pandemic. That's why, a lot of confusion and a lot of, losses, regarding to finance, regarding to life, people regarding to healthcare. Uh, that's why we have to prepare more regarding training for the doctor, for the nurses, also regarding change the education from STEM, science, technology, engineering, math or art to STEM with double M, science, technology, engineering, art, math, and medicine. We have to add medicine. We have to to everyone know about medicine, because what's happened in COVID-19. That's one of my suggestions. So I think that because of COVID-19 starting in a very advanced country in technology, China. That's why we all the world are happy that China are very advanced in technology, and this technology the technology of the 21st century helps China a lot in diagnosis and remote access and to avoid infection. A lot of things with this use of this new technology, 5G, artificial intelligence, IoT, cloud computing. That's why my suggestion to adopt this technology not only in Asia and in Europe, in USA, but in all the world for the future by the pandemic. So before I talk about the importance of this new technology and a lot of things. We have to all to appreciate and get benefit of this new technology of the 21st century, like blockchain, digital currency, cloud computing, tactile internet, digital twin, IoT, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality. That help robotic help a lot in the pandemic. First, I would like to mention how this technology will help a lot. For example, to achieve the 17 SDG for the uh, it's a key to IT response to climate change. As we know that if climate change, we still have a rise in temperature. This temperature was not good because it will help for the to virus to spread, and we can see a lot of viruses. That's why you have to to think about this point also for creating smart city, for protected environment, for changing healthcare by changing the life of a patient, for preventing global warming, reconstructing, building disaster, and come back to do a lot of things, plus that, improves the GDP. If you invest like, 10% in this technology, the GDP will increase by 1% or 2%. Also, help a lot, in healthcare and the military, natural application, help elderly and handicapped people. So, for healthcare, this new technology can positively influence the healthcare sector by reading the DNA structure and detecting the diseases at early stage. Technology will help to calculate the probability of a cancer, for example, development or studies Parkinson's diseases in detail. As you can say, that treatment is, that cure is better than treatment. Also, smart device can help to prevent the spread of infection like Zika virus, COVID-19, to find the infected cases, learning about the condition, to write a report on each case, and delivering, food and medicine to the patient in the hospital to prevent contact and communication, to sterilize the street and deliver medicine, to hospital and food to avoid infection, for measuring fever, temperature, and to the extent of wearing the muzzle to warn people, raising awareness of the danger of COVID-19 or any virus, and to measure the temperature and the extent of wearing the muzzle in a remote area, diagnostic session for remote patient plans and ambulance, without a driver to transport, establishment of a new health system, for each person on a bike. For example, three colors, green, yellow, and red, allowing you freedom of movement, yellow in a certain place and red with a quarantine. So cloud of everything, will help in the virus detection and the prevention and control infection diseases. It will, for example, to know the risk level by activity. In a, nine levels, the most danger two level represent, nine level places like large music concert bars, and then it's level like, sport stadium or gym, church, and mosque in a red color. Level 7 to level 6 in a second base like school, basketball, then movie theater, restaurant, in all in orange color. Level 5 like airplane, mall in a yellow color, and level 4 in light green like doctor's office, waiting room. Level 3 to 1 in dark green, and in sequence like hotel, getting fuel, getting take out from restaurant. Also, to know the probability, of contagion is very high. 90% of two-person, one healthy and other infected, does not wearing a mask, and they know 70% if the healthy one wear a mask and the infected one does not wear a mask, and median 5% if the infected one wear a mask and the healthy one does not wear a mask, and 1.5 of both wearing a mask, and the non-healthy one stay at home. That's why they know the most important thing to detect the infected person by using this new technology, and the people that attach to him by this new technology, cloud of everything, to reduce the number of infected and dead people with COVID-19 infections. That's why, I suggest, for the future, for this, adoption of this new technology in all countries, not in Asia, not in, in USA, but also in Arab country and African country, to prepare well, for this pandemic. Thank you so much for giving a chance to talk. Thank you, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you, Dr. Musa. Now I request Mr. David Schumacher, feature of pandemic preparations and response, or you want to add any interesting aspect from different part of the world.
Well, I certainly want to add something. I guess we'll wait to be determined to find out whether it's interesting or not. So where I want to start today is from my perspective with the Transhumanist Party, because I think there's something there that's worth offering. For example, let's start with going to the webpage for the Transhumanist Party, which is transhumanist-party.org. So those of you who are listening, either do that now or make a note of it and do it later. And I encourage you to read a couple of different areas when you go there. The first one will be in the area of core ideals. And there are three, not necessarily in order of importance, by the way, but core ideal number 3 says the Transhumanist Party supports efforts to use science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate various existential threats to the human species. So existential threats can be anything from nuclear war to something that decimates economies, decimates our level of civilization that we have it. And a pandemic on a grand enough scale could certainly be considered an existential threat. Many would say that COVID-19 was horrible, and I would agree, but they would also say it's not the worst pandemic that they could envision. So the next pandemic that comes along, and yes, there will be a next pandemic. It's not an if there'll be, there will be a next pandemic. Will it be more severe, less severe? Will it be in line with what we experienced with COVID-19? We have some ways to think about future pandemics that can help, but nobody has a precise answer to that. So my point is, let's use science and technology and rational discourse. I think that's also an important aspect. I'm director of applied innovation. I'm very interested in science. My background is engineering. But rational discussion of ideas is what can move these forward. And that is perhaps something that I saw missing in some cases as we addressed COVID-19 worldwide. So core ideal number 3. And that goes hand in hand with another section on the Transhumanist Party webpage that I'd invite you to reach, which is called the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. And it talks about rights as we move into the future. And they're more expansive in what they cover and how they cover than you may think. So I would encourage you to read those. So Article 14 of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights says transhumanists stand opposed to the post-truth culture of deception. All government should be required to make decisions and to communicate information rationally in accordance with the facts. Lying for political gain or intentionally fomenting irrational fears among the general public should entail heavy political fines for the officials who engage in such behaviors. Wherever you weigh in on how COVID-19 was handled, you could probably read into that there were those that were using the pandemic for their own personal gain, either the gain of their company or their gain politically as a politician or for geopolitical politics among countries. I think we as humans need to take a stand against that and speak loudly wherever we can. And it comes back to this idea of rational discourse and having a set of facts that we can understand. It's okay for us to disagree on matters of opinion, but we need to be able to establish rational facts as a basis of discussion for going forward to handle any kind of threat, especially a pandemic threat. So having those thoughts in mind, what are some of the things that we can do? Thank you, Dr. Mosa, for your introduction as far as what you were talking about with technology and so forth. I appreciate that. I think one of the things that we've learned as far as the technology from pandemics has been vaccinations, especially vaccinations using messenger RNA technology. And that goes beyond vaccinations for communicable diseases as we think of them, as there are mRNA vaccines being developed for the likes of things like cancer. But it takes going back and really understanding from the general public's point of view what a messenger RNA vaccine is and how it works and how it can be positioned against a particular pathogen so much faster than the way that we have done these things in the past. I think we need to be able to develop that trust in these kinds of technologies and go back and having this rational discussion that I talked about. So when it comes to those vaccines, I think we need them from at least two ways that I'm thinking of. Number one is we don't know what the next pandemic is going to be, as I've said, but we have some ideas of where pathogens are entering into humankind, and we can monitor those, especially the ones that jump from animals to humans. We can monitor those, and we can try to develop vaccines for those in advance. Another one is we know that there's pathogens out there that can essentially explode and cause regional or global outbreaks. Those, I think, should be embedded in normal vaccine responses. So that would be prevention, doing those, say, like incorporating additional protection inside of what I take like an annual influenza vaccination. And then we can anticipate by looking at what is to be emerging and to be working on those and getting ahead of this. I think the other aspect of this, though, goes to testing and reporting standards. Those varied widely throughout the world. They vary widely throughout my country. And some of that was technological, but much of it was ideological. And I think we as people need to have a conversation, once again, rooted in what the essential facts are, taking into account various opinions and coming up with a way that we can test on a reasonable basis and have confidence in the reporting structure that we have. Because if we don't have good data, if we don't have a good picture of what's going on, how can we respond to that? So I'll start with those ideas, and I'm interested in hearing more from the other panelists. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor David Smith.
Sharif, I love what has been said so far. And one of the truisms is that we're beginning to learn as we look around the world is that we're seeing different types of diseases and pathogens and things that can emerge as future pandemics. And we're also seeing that the emergency management and the public health disaster responses as we do activities. For example, in February of last year, there was a outbreak of Ebola in Ghana that really helped demonstrate how some of our responses have changed. And you see groups like the World Health Organization, who now has a global outbreak alert and response network. That's job is to aggregate and fuse together all the data and help very quickly identify new infectious diseases and what is their pandemic potential. And what we've also seen is governments and NGOs putting in place rapid response groups to let them begin to see that if a pathogen does make it past local monitors and starts to spread, there is an existing interlink between many nations, emergency management system in place to respond. And what was missing in the early days of COVID was there wasn't a command structure to provide a framework to respond to crisis that truly can look at a global nature. And, this could be an infectious disease, it could be a natural disaster, or a terrorist attack that this type of emergency management system could respond to. And that if I look in the United States, kind of what we have done here, but an important part of answering your question, Sharif, of what is the future pandemic preparation and response, really goes to one of the things we need to do is we need to shore up the systems already in place, and we need to do a better job of connecting and interconnecting the systems in place on a global basis. Because a pandemic, in today's definition, is a global basis. One of the other things that we saw during COVID and the various mutations of COVID is the public response is important, but we still have so many barriers to how to handle a public response to a pandemic. We've heard things like flatten the curves and the messages, but we've also seen that there was tremendous confusion and things in the United States, state by state, but also country by country. And, with the changes in China last week of their COVID rules, we see even in places there's mixed messages on how we can let the public take part. And we also, because these are global pandemics, there's language and cultural differences that have to be met. And because the world today is a very mobile society, immigration concerns and how do we travel, how do we conduct commerce is a very important part of what do we need to do there. One of the other things we learned from COVID, and we're seeing practiced, and it's what helped us with the last Ebola potential outbreak and others, is we're seeing people begin to have practice sessions in both countries and inter-countries, and seeing how those can be up. And that's one of the things that globally we need to do more. And we need to really begin to look at how are we going to polish the playbook that we have when it comes to future pandemics, and what are we going to do. So the other question you asked on this is, Sharif, what are some of the key learnings? And one of the key learnings is that there have been throughout COVID many complaints about are they equitable? are the poor nations being penalized, or the poor in society being penalized? Does the wealthy have more access to stuff? And what we see from this is that equitable access requires an end-to-end solution that centers on public health and the needs of the very most vulnerable at every step. And this goes back even into securing the supply chain and turning them into solutions to fight the pandemic. So this is, how do we complete end-to-end solutions from early stage identifying it, the initial medical response, early stage research and development. How do we scale up manufacturing? How do we look at distribution? How do we set up consistent policy guidance? How do we set up the operational, logistic, regulatory, and legal frameworks? And further along the road, how do we actually deliver what we're talking about to the patients? And how do we then track the patient? And how do we begin to put this into a framework that can be used internationally as well? Because then you have to get an international play, logistics, in-country delivery. How do you get the PPE, I'm sorry, personal protective equipment for the healthcare workers? And how do you pull it back into a global database system so that we know what's working, what's not working, where different variations to the drugs, to the virus is happening, where it's beginning to morph and change into different types of diseases. As we've seen COVID, it has gone through over a dozen different changes as it's morphed into new variations of COVID. And how do we put those elements together? There's a lot more that goes to that, but these are some of the things that we have begun to see as we look at best practices that are coming out of COVID. There's numerous bodies globally doing task forces on how do we taper a better response. The World Health Organization is one that has put considerable committees together, all aimed at how do we do a better job of preparation and response, because we know future pandemics are highly likely. And how do we identify it, or how do we identify a potential pandemic early enough that we can prohibit it from becoming a pandemic? And that thinking is really the key to us being successful, I believe, in preparing the world for what could become future pandemics. So, Sharif, I think this is probably a good point right now to let's circle back around and have additional thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Musa. You are from Africa, from the developing world. So, what do you think? What is their preparations, and specifically, my objective is that research and innovations. When we are talking about future pandemic preparations and response, how the developing nations actually investing in research and innovations. We observe vaccine play a major role in COVID-19 situations, and in some point, still many of the people do not get vaccine. This is the complaint. Actually, I work in the developing nations with the many people, government agencies, and corporations. I specifically our World Talent Economy Forum. We observing that. When we discussing about vaccine and different kind of innovations, developed nations they control these things, and developing nations we are follower of these technology innovations and everything. And especially our grassroots level people or our people from developing nations, uh, most of the cases they do not have access of this modern science, engineering, and technology. How we can take preparations, how we can overcome this kind of struggle. Financial issue is a big issue right now, so what is your aspect, how we can change this ecosystem?
Yeah, I think my response is that we have to make cooperation, developing country with developed countries. So, for example, to know how, we would like, to change, for example, Africa or from passive, consumer to active producer. That's why, our target, we need, to reduce the gap, between Africa, among Africa, and all the developed country. How can we do that? We can do that, by cooperation, and the development country, must, help, developing country to let them know how, and in technology, know how, and modern technology help, for example, as you said, on climate change crisis, that the developed country, promise the developed country for, found $100 billion, each year, but they didn't, fulfill the promise. So it must, like help, between, or, cooperate between developed country and the developed country regarding to, know-how technology, regarding to finance, because, if something happened bad, in Africa, it will, maybe spread in all the world. What's happened in China, when COVID-19 started, in China, and after that it spread in all the world, because, there's, airplanes, there's aviation, there's, trade. That's why, if any, virus, uh, uh, infect any country, it will, spread in all the world. That's why, we have to look in, for cooperation. Regarding to vaccine, let me say that, for developed country, maybe percentage like 68 percentage, of people got vaccine. For, for developing country, maybe 14%, something like that. But let me say, maybe, the vaccine is not enough, or not enough for developing country. But let me say something else, is that, some people, got scared from vaccine, because, there's a lot of rumors, or a lot of talk that this vaccine, maybe harm to the people, maybe, uh, not test enough, to take it. So I think it's not all about, if you have the quantity of vaccine or not. There are also some related to psychiatric, something like that. So some people is scared that this vaccine, is not up to date. This vaccine, maybe harm, body, or something like that. This vaccine, need, time, to test it. That's why, I think, for the version I told you, we have to also, concentrate in education. As we always say, in education STEM, like science, technology, engineering, math, art, but we have to add M more. So we say STEM was double M. So science, technology, engineering, art, math, and medicine. Why medicine? Because what's happened in COVID-19, not only, for doctors or for nurses, do you know to get, training about, the virus, something like that, but, every normal person have to get enough information how to, to avoid the infection, how to, to make sure that, how to treat well, when the time that he must go to the doctor, when he got something, medicine. So I think, awareness for, for medicine, very important, for all people, because we have not all, people in all the world are very educated or very educated, but we have ignorant people. So these ignorant people, maybe help to spread, the virus, something like that, because they didn't, follow the precaution and instruction, of the virus. That's why, we have to change, the mentality. So we have to prepare for the next pandemic, because the world, for example, let me say that, I have a conference, I was invited to be, a conference chaired, in China 2 days ago. This, conference supposed to be, inside, but till now, China, I think, have problems, with COVID-19. That's why, they move from, inside to online. So still, we have to take, a precaution, to make sure that we are all the world prepare for the next pandemic. The world is still, without a doubt, under the influence of COVID-19, while some people are still afraid of the disease and think about where to wash their hands, public health or something like that. So a lot of precaution must, we have to take. For example, establish and strengthen identification and reporting outbreak system. Like example, universal or something like that. Identify leading threat and service, connecting the public and the private sectors. Also, we have to develop and distribute a new vacancy, globally, not, in a developed country, but for all developed country and the developed country, and develop, test, and use a new technology. That's why I talk about, cloud of everything technology, because of China, are very advanced this technology. It will help a lot. I imagine that if this, COVID-19 appears in one of the developing countries, I think that, there is a crisis more, and, disaster more, and a lot of people, because they are not prepared, they are not having this new technology to know about the infected cases, to avoid, to like for cure or something like that. The last point, to prepare the people, for the next pandemic. Not only, doctors, not only, nurses, but, all the people have to get all the information, or, like need to know. Yeah, for a normal person, you have to know some information, but for doctors, for nurses, they must know, a lot of advanced information. That's my point there. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharif, and all speaker, for giving me a chance to talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Shumakar. Very simple that how developing nations can get more access to different research and innovation projects. Uh, Specifically, transhumanist parties has lot of engagement for this kind of things, but I want to request more transhumanist parties, how they can make more global uh, organization, how they can engage with more communities, uh, how they can contribute more for the emerging economy people. Specifically, I want to say about Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific, around 40% community live there. Uh, I want more contribution. What do you want to say?
So I think one of the major benefits of transhumanism in general, and the transhumanist party specifically, is taking science, health, and technology and putting that at the forefront of discussions. Okay, that should come before money, should come before ideology. These are the things that we can quantify and perhaps agree on as far as facts are concerned. And then we can apply our various ideology, religious backgrounds, whatever they might be. Those values can then be applied against the particular facts that we have. But how do we get that started? So I think that a good way to get that started is to spread the message. And one way of spreading the message is through organizations like the one that I'm in, or our allied organization, the Transhuman Club, for those that are more interested in other aspects of science, health, and technology than political involvement. So, Dr. Sharif, perhaps at the universities where you teach, you have a science club or you have an engineering club. But why not a transhumanist club? Why not a club that takes science and engineering and takes it to the next step and says, okay, what can we do with this? How can we apply this against the world's problems, and specifically keeping our eyes up and looking at those problems in advance before they're so close that they overrun us? When we do that, we help change the political landscape, because I think as people become more comfortable with what science and engineering can do, and they can see the health benefits of incorporating quantitative thought, rational discussion, that they are more trusting and less fearful. Because let's be honest, what you don't trust, you fear, and what you fear, you resist. And we saw a lot of that during COVID-19. So back to the central part of your question, how do you do that in countries like your own, which I think then is growing that grassroots organization, whether it be at university club level, or maybe in secondary schools, or maybe just general community outreach for people that are interested, that seriously want to make things better. Now, how do you Another part of your question, I think, is how do you get research and so forth to come to developing countries? And I think we're seeing some of that already, at least in another area that I work in, which is longevity. Like in the United States, for example, longevity, whether it be drugs for longevity, whether it be drugs for COVID, which obviously have an impact on longevity, or any other type of pathogens. The developed countries like the United States and countries in Europe have a very heavily regulated system. And now there's reasons for that, and I won't go into all of those, and I'm not going to espouse whether they're good or bad. I'm just going to say that they're there. So I'm seeing a lot of longevity drug companies moving offshore out of the United States and moving into other countries that will help them develop safely, but without necessarily the burden of decades of health regulations, which can slow or impede the process. So if you have this grassroots effort, people understanding science and technology, especially in terms of health, and wanting to make improvements and willing to bring in research from the outside, I think that is an area that benefits developing countries and in the long run benefits the developed countries, because perhaps they can learn from that, and certainly they will benefit from whatever comes out of that development. So there's some thoughts about how those things can go. And I think the Transhumanist Party and science and health groups and engineering groups are all interested in seeing this happen. It's getting the word out into the popular culture that helps, because there's so many other competing ideas for what should be important and what people should be talking about. But what's more important than our health, the health of our children, and the health of the nation? Thank you, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher. David Smith, sorry.
I love what has been said by the prior speakers again. There's a lot of wisdom which is being put into the program today. And taking my approach, which we were talking about earlier, part policy, part science, part technology, and part looking at how the world responds to governance and other things, there's still a lot that we need to do as we look at future pandemic preparations and how we're going to respond to it. So to kind of build upon some of what I talked about earlier, is one of the things that critical action is needed for at this time is how do we prioritize strengthening the end-to-end capabilities during really non-pandemic times? How do we get ready for the next one when it happens, so that instead of a lead lag time of response, we have the capabilities in place to respond early and hopefully prevent the pathogens or influenza or whatever it is from becoming a pandemic. There's an old saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And in this instance, I think that saying kind of works here, because the more we can do during a non-pandemic to put the things in place, the better we're going to be when an emergency strikes. And how can we look at the response? How can we look at surge capability, emergency processes, systems, and particularly global responses? I keep going back to the global responses, but the reality is this is our society today really works on a global basis, and we need to understand that our responses need to be a global basis. I'll give you a great example personally. I have a group of friends here in Austin, Texas, who just traveled to the Holy Lands. And it was a group of 24 people making this tour approach. And what happened there is when they came back to the United States last week, all 21 were COVID positive. All 21. Not one or two, but all 21. And it was picked up during the trip to the Holy Land. And they also came back on an airplane full of people. So, you begin to look at that and see that the responses have to be global because it was acquired, it was spread with people traveling globally. And like I said, it was a 100% infection rate, which the new strain of COVID is very, very infectious right now. And luckily, the new strain is more like a really bad flu than the early strains. But that to me highlights the fact that this is global and we need global responses. We also need to establish, and David, I know you're not going to like these words I'm going to use with a humanist party response, but we need to establish really clear standards. We need to establish processes and expectations for rapid, agile, end-to-end governance, decision making, communication, transparency, and risk sharing. And how do we do that when the data we're receiving is often asymmetrical? And we're looking at ways where it's hard to understand if it's an apple or an orange or a banana or a watermelon as we begin to look at the data and as we begin to harmonize it. And I'm all about for independence in governance, in regulations. But on the other hand, when we're dealing with a global pandemic, we have to look at ways, how can we harmonize those regulations and governances and things when there is a true global emergency. And I would say COVID is a great example. Ebola is a great example of global emergencies as we see how to respond to them. And how do we do that? And governance is such an individual cultural basis, such an individual national basis. But the example of the group traveling to the Holy Land in black is a great example that these pandemics don't respect national borders and stuff. And how can we do it? One of the big early lessons learned from COVID is that during global crises and when there's great uncertainty about when medical interventions where drugs, vaccines, and others will become available, governments will always seek to protect their own citizens first. And this, during COVID, you saw some of the wealthiest governments leveraging their resources to hedge against the unknown, ordering large volumes of doses and leaving the rest of the world at the back of the queue. And you're going to see this type of thing. So one of the practices we need to look at change is we need to see how do we take this hoarding, export restriction, and nationalism and how we begin to use it. We spoke yesterday about the impacts of climate change, and you saw the same thing there. We see climate change have the same type of hurdles as we do on how do we look at pandemic responses with hoarding and nationalism built into it. And do we begin to look at if a global pandemic is declared and who declares it? Does that automatically set up a pool for the poorer nations, for developing nations, as part of the process? And does that need to be built into any response, which clearly was not the case during COVID? And how do we begin to do that? And one way might be is to increase and geographically diversify vaccine manufacturing. And how do we do the technology transfer and demand side financing for that? And how do we do it? Another really strong best practice we learned is a successful global pandemic response involves taking risks. And as you begin to look really for the first year of COVID, there was tremendous risk taking. I saw a recent study that in the United States, in the first 3 months of COVID here, that 90% of the people admitted to a hospital emergency room for COVID and who went on to treatment did not make it out of the hospital. But then we see the mortality rates as we understood it more really fall. But that during that first initial surge, 90% mortality if they went into the hospital. How can we begin to understand that? How can we look at how we can up the risk taking? What was very interesting during those first 3 to 5 months of COVID is you saw healthcare professionals and scientists dramatically increase their ability to take risks with patients because there was not a known protocol for dealing with it. There was not known drugs that worked. You saw a concept in the United States called other use protocols, where it was drugs developed to treat one thing being pulled over and applied to this with almost as much thought as it was a gut level hunch by physicians that it would work. In some cases it did, in some cases it didn't. But that risk taking is really part of a response to pandemics. And, part of what you see there is there should be a cleared and shared understanding of risk thresholds and risk sharing. And recognize that in a rapidly spreading pandemic, that a higher risk threshold is necessary. And, we probably want to begin to look at ways to do contingent at-risk funding for global health agencies and hospitals and pharmaceuticals if there is a rapidly spreading pandemic. And how do we sustain and leverage existing financial mechanisms to do that? And then, in just beginning to look at it, we need to realize that there's tremendous change underway. And we see that. And we see nations now coming together and saying, well, here's what I did right. Here's what I did wrong. And we're now beginning to see nations share that outside their own borders. I mean, I was encouraged with China's announcements last week of the changes they were making and the reasons they were making some of those. One of the immunologists I follow in the United States is being very proactive now, saying, even though most of us don't want to wear a mask, these are the people in the population who should wear masks today. These are the places in the population where masks should be worn. Do I like wearing a mask? I hate wearing a mask. But there are places where I go where I have my N95 mask sitting in my car. I have the N95 mask in my computer case. And yes, if I go to those places, I will pull one out and put it on. But don't look for me to be wearing my N95 mask when I'm on the dance floor dancing and doing those things. But you begin to see those types. So there's a lot we still have to learn. And there's a lot of coordination and collaboration that still needs to be done. But the fact that nations are beginning to share not only what went well, but what went wrong. And we learn equally from best practices and worst practices, because that body of knowledge is what allows us to advance faster when the next pandemic hits. So Sharif, I think that's probably a good place to stop again.
Thank you. Dr. Musa, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Yeah, my concluding remark is that that our best hope in the future is to build for the worst, in the fires, in the climate crisis, in the economy. So we have to be well for the next pandemic. For example, to monitor zones, because the biggest risk comes from pathogens that circulate in animals. So we have to monitor it using technology or something like that. Also, we have to sequence globally. So we have to cooperation, between all countries in all the world, and we have to strengthen and manufacture, because we need some tools, and these tools get by manufacture for example vaccine or therapeutic or something like that. Also to prevent vaccine for rapid protection, and stop the spread of the virus, and also for universal adoption of the technology that will help a lot in all sectors, like in manufacture, and industry, and agriculture, and healthcare. Especially we need it not in Asia, but also in Africa, for universal adoption for this new technology. As we say always, cure is better than treatment. That's why you have to use this new technology, and hoping that we need for peace in all the world, on peace and cooperation, because without peace we cannot do anything. With peace we can do everything with cooperation, and then we need universal adoption of this new technology that will help a lot in future pandemic preparation and response. Also to
Dr. Musa, I think he has internet issues. Mr. David Schumacher.
I'll conclude today with an idea that I think is very important, and I think I'm going to call that idea remember. Right now, we're talking about COVID-19. We're talking about something that is still ongoing, and the worst of it is in our recent past. But it won't always be. There have been pandemics before. There have been infectious disease outbreaks, maybe not called pandemics. And we didn't remember when we were done. Okay? Or it doesn't look like we remembered. For example, there hadn't been a pandemic. There had been safeguards set up in the United States for fighting pandemics that were not being funded by Congress, because that was not the most important issues. Matter of fact, internal organizations in the US government were disbanded, some of those shortly before COVID-19 broke out. I'm not pointing fingers here. I'm talking about human nature. We focus on what's happening now and what's happened in our recent past and what might happen to us. So we've got this scope about like this, and things that are bigger in scope from a time standpoint tend to go to the back of the bus, so to speak. And we're going to fund other things that might be considered to be more timely, more important. So how do we remember? I've been in organizations where we've launched major campaigns, if you will, and we did those. And then when the campaign was done, we had a session where we would go through, and people were responsible for documenting what had happened, much like what David Smith was talking about. What went right, what went wrong, trying to be as brutally honest about that as possible, documenting it. And if there were things that needed action, to take action on those, but realizing that there was going to be tomorrow's problem, which could overshadow what just happened, we might forget. So we have this documentation so that when it happens again in the future, we're not starting at ground zero. We can go back and we can look at something that was previous, that was similar, and maybe try to learn from that. So that is one of the approaches: is we learn, we document, we implement what we can, And perhaps we set up reviews that say, every given a period of time, we come back and we look at this, even though that it's not the problem of the day, and remind ourselves what's going on, and then go back to working on the problems of the day, because we need to do that too. There typically aren't resources to cover everything, but we can't afford to forget. We need that remembrance, and we need to work out mechanisms to do this. I gave you one way that happened in organizations that I came out of. Perhaps there's other ways that can also improve on this. Maybe the use of artificial intelligence will allow us to do this, to where we can factor in problems that we're working on today with a better recollection of history than what the human mind has, by letting artificial intelligence keep those at the forefront. So that's a technological approach, but there can be others. However we do it, we need to not forget what we've gone through so that we don't start all over again next time. Thank you, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you. Dr. Musa, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
You're muted still.
Yeah, as I said, we have to, our best hope, in all the world, people in all the world, is to prepare for the worst, because maybe the worst will come, So there's ways to prepare for the next pandemic. For example, to monitor zones, because the big stress comes from pathogens that circulate in animals. Also, sequence globally, because this happened, in all the world. Strengthens manufacture, because what's happened, the manufacture of vaccines and therapeutic, we have to concentrate and manufacture, prepare vaccine, for rapid protection, and stop, the spread. Also, we have, to look for peace, because with peace we can do anything, with peace and cooperation, but without peace we cannot do anything. We have to look for universal adoption for this new technology to help, in future pandemic preparation and response. Also finance, developing country, can help the developing country, as what's happened, in climate crisis. That's all, we need to, as I say, to hand over, the earth or the planet to the future generation in a better way, not end, viruses, COVID-19, bad economy, unemployment, in our wars. That's why, we need to hand over, the earth, our planet, to the future generation in a better way. And this is our target, for this, generation. Thank you so much, Dr. Sharif, for giving me a chance to talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Musa. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, Sharif, thank you for allowing me to be part of today, and our two other speakers, thank you. Excellent points, much wisdom you put on the table. I want to direct my concluding remarks at what we've learned the last 100 years, and see how it applies to where we're headed. So let's go back 100 years ago, and let me go back to the 1918 H1N1 influenza pandemic. And what was interesting back then is, during that time, at least here in the United States, few Americans had telephones. But the quarantine rules that were put in place then led more and more people to use phones, and hastened research that led our telephone system become scalable. Because in 1918, all the phone calls were switched by operators on switchboards. Not very scalable, but also with the operators there in rows after row, the N1H1 was very transmittal to that audience too. And a lot of them got sick and died. So you saw technology beginning to be used and applied as a part of that way to reduce reliance, for example, on human telephone operators, and use of telephones to be able to deal with the quarantines that were put in place with the H1N1 pandemic. Well, I can talk about each of the intervening pandemics and potential pandemics at different levels, but let's just focus in my concluding remarks on COVID. COVID triggered some rapid changes that will last, and some that were temporary and others, but it will help the world be ready for other future events. And, it's been a lot easier with COVID to make the necessary lifestyle adaptations than in many past pandemics. You know, we can look at this as the way technology has changed what we do at home, the way what we do at work, how we do things. So, for example, you have seen technology during COVID change the workplace, the classroom, the delivery of healthcare. If I began to look at how rapid the move was to video teleconferencing, to telehealth, and remote offices for workers during 2020, my guess is, and my forecast is that we will see those very rapid changes that were made during COVID as part of the response to COVID become permanent. And if I'm looking at future preparation responses, I hope that we know enough that we can see that those need to further be enhanced. We know that teleteaching was a response that helped with COVID, but we also know that it hurt a generation of students because of the lack of social emotional learning, the lack of that it wasn't equal, and other things like that. So we should be able to take where those have happened and the fact that they will be going on in the future, we should work to improve them. Let's look at some of the other things. We're beginning to see how robotics and automated systems are being used in the pandemic responses in clinical care, in public health, in public safety systems, in retail, in restaurants, and other things like that. Well, let's see how we can take robotics and these automated systems that were beginning to be used here and see if we can expand them and continue to work them in light of being ready for a future pandemic. And, the other really key point here is because of the sudden and very dramatic changes to the norms and behaviors because of COVID, like the use of face masks in public, the use of quarantine, of not only quarantining individuals, but whole cities and regions, and the restrictions on international travel. These might be strategies to keep in our back pocket as a place to fend off a future pandemic. But also we see that these damage commerce, these damage relationships and others. So how can we begin to do that? How can we use our view of technology? And remember, technology doesn't have to be a thing. It's the application of knowledge to achieve a result. So just like the telephone systems continue to improve over the last 100 years to let us do things like remote work for office, like video teleconferencing, like telehealth. Those were enhancements that began back in 1918 with the H1N1 influenza pandemic that have been changing all the way through today that helped us with our response today. How can we continue to improve to build rapid adaptation of technologies that will help people and society and governments and institutions adjust to sudden lifestyle changes when the next pandemic hits, and help us craft a rapid response that hopefully we have in place the early warning signals, a monitoring surveillance system that will give us an early warning signals so that we can start the scientific work that's going to be necessary to craft a response. Those are the places where we should take the technologies we saw, the science we saw, the policies, regulations, the procedures we saw, and refine them so that our future pandemic preparation and response can be that much more effective. Now, I really, when I began to look at the last 100 years from that pandemic to here, with just how the system has adapted to let us be better prepared to deal with this pandemic. We're going to see that change. I actually am uh, like what I'm seeing with the transportation industry, with some of the advances we see in how we deal with airflow in airplanes, how we deal with handling of different materials and things being put in place as preparations for a next pandemic. But we need to refine those probably even more as we look at it, because the problem is the half-life of our memory of a pandemic is awfully short, and that we need to continue to learn how to learn as we go forward and look at how do we prepare and how do we respond to future pandemics. So Sharif, thank you. That's my concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. This is excellent discussion. Specifically, I'm sure it will be very, very helpful for our community, for the emerging economy. Strategically, we have a lot of challenge, but we need more collaboration, more partnership with the knowledgeable society, with the knowledge-oriented society. I know many entrepreneurs, they love to solve problem, but because of lack of knowledge, they cannot take the preparations and everything. That's why TANDO, Transhumanist Party, United Nations, World Economic Forums, all of the left wing, right wing, everyone's we are inviting in World Talent Economic Forum, and we try to learn from your dialogue and discussions. We learn from our research and we execute it. I'm sure when you come and visit our projects, our activities, our school, college, hospital, smart city, smart village, you will be really impressed with the executions of dialogue, because most of the people love to do talk, but taking actions is very, very difficult. So
Exactly.
we are taking actions, and hopefully our small contribution with the social entrepreneur, because I love to give special thanks to my lot of social entrepreneurs, those who supporting our project, those who joining in our projects, those who actively involved in our projects, and they are actually taking the initiative to solve the problem. So I want to give thanks to all of the contributors, all of the speaker, those who sharing their expertise, their knowledge, all of the social entrepreneur, those who are taking action, those who are learning from World Talent Economy Forums, all of the bankers, government agencies, corporation, those who collaborate with us. And this is the way hopefully we can overcome from the challenging moments. We need more collaborations, we need more partnerships. Specifically, this 16 December, this is the Victory Day for Bangladesh, and definitely we are working with Professor David Smith. We are solving healthcare problem in South Asia. So hopefully, your guideline, your contributions, hopefully it will be very effective. And thank you, Mr. David Schumacher. Hopefully, Transhumanist Party more support World Talent Economy Forum projects, and hopefully you can visit country like India, Bangladesh, and you can contribute more. And Dr. Musa, I want to give
So,
special thanks because you are the voice of Africa. You are actually
thank you as
contribute
well.
a lot, and you are representing our World Talent Economy Forums.
Thank
So
you, Dr.
thank you,
Sharif.
everyone. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye bye,
Thank you,
and
Mr.
take care.
David. Thank you, Dr. David. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.